Blood under the fingernails tells you more about a person than the cut of their dress. Down in Cutter's Ridge, folks worshipped Josephine's spun sugar hair and porcelain smile. They spat when her older sister Abigail walked by, reeking of lye and raw hide. When Harlan came down from the high timber looking for a wife, everyone figured he'd trade his prime winter pelts for the town beauty. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Sometimes a starving man doesn't want cake. He needs meat. Frost clung to the mule's whiskers, turning the beast's muzzle into a crust of white ice. Harlan Wade breathed out, watching his own breath mingle with the animal's in the thin, biting air of the high altitude. His knuckles wrapped tight around the frayed hemp-led rope were split and bleeding, the skin cracked like old parchment. He didn't feel the sting anymore. You stop feeling the little pains after 5 years above the snow line. It's the silence that starts to hurt. Harlan wasn't a man given to poetry. The mountain was a ledger of calories in and calories out. Wood chopped, meat smoked, pelts stretched. But the isolation had begun to rot him from the inside. Last month, he caught himself talking to a dead fire, waiting for the ash to answer back. That was the day he packed his prime winter beaver, and fox furs tied them down over the mule's swayback, and started the long descent toward Cutter's Ridge. He needed flour. He needed coffee. Most of all, he needed a living, breathing human being to sit on the other side of his hearth. Not a hired hand. A wife. The transition from the absolute stillness of the pines to the chaotic mud of Cutter's Ridge jarred his senses. The town smelled of sulphur-cheap coal smoke and horse manure, baking in the low afternoon sun. Harlan's boots, wrapped in oiled elk hide, sank 2 inches into the muck of Main Street. He hated it immediately. The noise of a dozen overlapping conversations, the clatter of wagon wheels, the sharp barking of a stray dog, it all felt like a physical assault. He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. He led the mule to Farnsworth's mercantile. The wooden boardwalk groaned under his weight. Harlan stepped inside, and the sudden shift from bright sunlight to the dim, dusty interior left him blind for a second. The air in the store was thick, cinnamon-cured tobacco and the metallic tang of bulk nails. "Help you, stranger." Harlan blinked the glare out of his eyes. Behind the polished oak counter stood a man in a vest that stretched too tight across a soft belly. Mr. Farnsworth. Before Harlan could answer, a woman stepped out from the back room. She stopped, framing herself perfectly in the doorway. Josephine Farnsworth. Harlan knew exactly what she was doing. He'd seen coyotes posture the same way before a kill. She tilted her chin, letting the pale light catch the gold in her hair. She wore a dress of pale blue cotton pristine and utterly useless for anything but standing still. Her hands were folded in front of her, the skin white and unblemished. She smelled of synthetic rosewater, a scent so heavy and unnatural it made the back of Harlan's throat itch. "Oh," Josephine said, her voice a practiced airy flutter. "We don't usually get trappers down this far until the thaw." Harlan didn't look at her face. He looked at her hands. Soft, weak. If she touched a cast-iron skillet, straight from the coals, she'd weep for a week. "Got pelts," Harlan said. His voice was a rasp. He hadn't used it to speak to another person in 8 months. It sounded like 2 rocks grinding together. "Need flour, salt, coffee, powder." Farnsworth's eyes gleamed as Harlan dropped the heavy-tied bundles onto the counter. The smell of cured animal fat and wild musk hit the room. Josephine delicately pinched her nose, taking a subtle step back. Harlan noticed. He noticed everything. Then the back door slammed open. The impact rattled the jars of hard candy on the shelves. Footsteps, heavy and dragging, echoed from the alleyway. A woman backed into the store, dragging a massive salt-crusted wooden barrel by its iron hoops. "Abigail, for heaven's sake," Farnsworth snapped. "Use the loading door." "Wagon's blocking it," the woman grunted. She didn't stop dragging the barrel until it was flush against the wall. When she turned around, Harlan felt a strange, cold jolt in his chest. She was the antithesis of the girl in the blue dress. Abigail Farnsworth wore a canvas apron, stiff with dried blood and brown stains. Her hair, a dull, unremarkable brown, was tied back with a piece of rough twine, loose strands sticking to the sweat on her forehead. She was broad-shouldered, her forearms thick and wrapped in thick leather braces. But it was her face that made folks in town look away. A jagged, silvery burn scar stretched from her left jawline down into the collar of her shirt, a gift from a rendering vat explosion years ago. She smelled like lye soap copper and hard labor. "This the last of the pork?" she asked her father, wiping a massive calloused hand across her brow. She didn't even glance at Harlan. "Yes." "Now go wash up. You're tracking brine everywhere, and you're upsetting your sister." Josephine sighed loudly. "Honestly, Abby, you smell like a slaughterhouse. We have a customer." Abigail finally looked at Harlan. Her eyes were flat, a storm grey color, completely devoid of the performative warmth her sister exuded. She looked at his split knuckles. She looked at his mud-caked boots. She didn't pinch her nose at the smell of his pelts. "Looks like he brought his own smell." Abigail said, her voice low and completely flat. Harlan felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It wasn't a smile exactly. He had forgotten how to do that. But it was an acknowledgement. "I'll take 50 pounds of the salt pork," Harlan told Farnsworth, but he kept his eyes on Abigail. She held his gaze for a second longer than was polite, wiped her hands on her ruined apron, and walked back out into the alley. Word travelled fast in Cutter's Ridge. By sundown, every soul in town knew Harlan Wade had traded $200 worth of prime Timberland fur and paid entirely in raw gold dust. Suddenly, the dirt beneath his fingernails was invisible to polite society. He took a room at the boarding house, scrubbing himself down with harsh lye soap in a tin tub until his skin was raw. It didn't help. He still felt dirty. Town dirt was different from mountain dirt. Mountain dirt was honest. Town dirt was a greasy film of gossip greed and cheap perfume. He was trapped here for 4 days while the blacksmith repaired a cracked axle on his pack wagon. 4 days of suffocating civilization. By the second day, the Farnsworths invited him to Sunday dinner. Harlan went only because his supplies were still sitting in their storehouse. The Farnsworth parlor was a nightmare of doilies and delicate china. The air was stiflingly hot, the fireplace roaring too high. Harlan sat on a velvet-backed chair that groaned ominously every time he shifted his weight. He kept his knees wide, his large hands resting awkwardly on his thighs. He felt like a caged bear prodded by sticks. Josephine sat across from him, sipping weak tea from a cup no bigger than a thimble. She hadn't stopped talking for 40 minutes. And Denver, they say, has a theater that seats 1,000 people. She was saying, her eyes wide and shining. "Have you ever been to Denver, Mr. Wade?" "No," Harlan said. "Oh, it must be dreadful being so far away from culture. Up there in the woods, just trees and dirt." She leaned forward, offering a sympathetic pout. "A man with your resources surely wouldn't want to spend his prime years freezing in the wilderness." She was fishing. She saw his gold and mapped out a future that involved him financing her escape from Cutter's Ridge. Harlan stared at her. He saw the calculation behind the porcelain smile. If he took her up the ridge, she would cry the first time the wind howled through the chinking. She would demand he sell the claim. If he refused, she would poison his food or go mad. "The woods are quiet," Harlan said slowly. "I like quiet." Josephine's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Well, yes. But surely a gentleman needs society. The heavy oak door to the kitchen swung open. Abigail walked in, carrying a massive cast-iron roast pan with bare hands. She set it down on the dining table with a heavy thud. Harlan watched her. He noted the way her muscles worked beneath the cheap cotton of her sleeves. He saw a fresh, angry red burn on her right wrist, right where the edge of the hot pan had brushed the skin. She didn't flinch. She didn't make a sound. She just adjusted her grip and pulled her hand away. "Dinner," Abigail announced. "Abigail, really?" Farnsworth scolded from his armchair. "Put some gloves on. Nobody wants to look at those hands while they eat." Abigail wiped her hands on her skirt. "Gloves slip on cast iron, Papa. Unless you want the roast on your rug, you'll look at my hands." Harlan let out a short, rough sound. It was half a cough, half a laugh. Josephine shot him a nervous look. "Please forgive my sister, Mr. Wade. Since Mother died, she's taken over the rough work. It's hardened her. She lacks refinement." "Refinement doesn't butcher a hog," Abigail muttered, turning back toward the kitchen. "Sit," Harlan said. The word cracked into the room like a bullwhip. The parlor went dead silent. Mr. Farnsworth paused halfway through lighting his pipe. Josephine's mouth fell open. Abigail stopped with her hand on the kitchen door, slowly turning to look at him over her shoulder. "Excuse me," Abigail said. "Sit down," Harlan repeated his voice, low, steady. "Eat." "She eats in the kitchen," Josephine said, her voice tightening with poorly concealed panic. "She prefers it. It's where she's comfortable." Harlan looked at Josephine. His eyes were pale blue, the color of glacial ice, and just as unforgiving. She cooked it. She carried it. She eats. He didn't wait for permission. He stood up the chair, creaking in relief, walked to the corner of the room, picked up a heavy wooden stool, and placed it next to his own chair at the table. He looked at Abigail. Abigail stared at him. For the first time, Harlan saw a flicker of something in her storm-grey eyes. Confusion. Suspicion. She looked at her father, who was too shocked to speak, then at Josephine, whose face was turning a mottled red. Slowly, Abigail walked to the table and sat on the stool. The dinner was agonizingly quiet. Josephine picked at her food, shooting venomous glances across the table. Mr. Farnsworth chewed mechanically. Harlan ate with terrifying efficiency, his manners atrocious but functional. Beside him, Abigail ate the same way. She didn't take tiny, polite bites. She ate like someone who knew that food was fuel, cutting the tough meat with a sharp, practiced motion of her knife. Harlan smelled her. Beneath the faint scent of lye, she smelled of pine resin and clean sweat. She smelled real. "Burn looks bad," Harlan murmured, not looking at her, keeping his eyes on his plate. Abigail paused. She looked at her red wrist. "I'll pack it in snow later. It'll blister. Then it'll callus." Nothing new. "I have a salve," Harlan said, quietly, his voice pitched so the others couldn't hear. "Bare fat and willow bark. Smells like hell. Works." Abigail finally turned her head to look at him. She didn't smile, but the hard lines of her jaw relaxed just a fraction. "I'm used to things that smell like hell." "I know," Harlan said. He finished his plate, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stood. "Thank you for the meal, Mr. Farnsworth. Miss Josephine." He didn't say goodbye to Abigail. He didn't need to. He knew he was going to see her again. The town's annual spring dance was held in the livery barn. They cleared out the stalls, laid down sawdust to soak up the horse piss, and hired a fiddler who only knew 3 tunes and played them all too fast. Harlan was forced to attend. The blacksmith needed an extra day for the axle, and Harlan couldn't sit in his tiny boarding room any longer without losing his mind. He stood in the corner of the barn, a cup of wretched, burning whiskey in his hand. His wool suit bought a decade ago and worn 3 times hitched tight under his arms. The air in the barn was a physical weight, body heat, cheap cologne spilled bare, and the frantic dust kicked up by dancing boots. He hated it. "Mr. Wade," Harlan closed his eyes for a brief second before turning. Josephine. She was wearing a dress of crushed crimson velvet. It was a beautiful dress, completely absurd for a dirt floor barn. She smiled up at him, her eyes batting in a rhythm that matched the frantic fiddle. "You haven't asked me to dance," she said, stepping closer. She reached out, resting 2 soft fingers on his forearm. Harlan looked at those fingers. He felt the light pressure through his wool sleeve. It made his skin crawl. It felt like a parasite latching on. "I don't dance," Harlan said bluntly. Josephine laughed, a bright, trilling sound that cut through the noise. "Oh, every man dances if he has the right partner. Come now, everyone is watching." She was right. Harlan glanced around. Over the shoulders of the spinning couples, he saw the townsfolk stealing glances at them. They were waiting for the transaction to finalize. The mountain man and the town beauty. It was a story they understood. "No," Harlan said, stepping back so her hand fell away. Josephine's smile froze. Her eyes went flat and hard, the facade cracking. "Pardon. I said no, I'm going outside." He didn't wait for her to recover. He pushed his way through the sweaty crowd, ignoring the muttered curses as his broad shoulders knocked into people. He hit the double barn doors and shoved them open, stepping out into the cool, sharp night air. He sucked in a massive breath, filling his lungs until they ached. The silence outside the barn was a mercy. He walked away from the light, heading toward the back of the livery where the shadows were deep. As he walked, a sound caught his attention. It wasn't the fiddle. It was a rhythmic, wet thud. Thwack, crunch, thwack, crunch. Harlan followed the sound. It led him behind the town's butchery shed, 50 yards from the barn. A single oil lantern hung from a rusty nail on the siding, casting long, jumping shadows. Beneath the lantern stood Abigail. She wasn't at the dance. She was wearing her stiff canvas apron over a worn flannel shirt. In front of her, strung up by its hind legs on a heavy timber frame, was a freshly slaughtered steer. Abigail held a heavy steel cleaver in her right hand. Her face was smudged with soot, and a streak of dried blood crossed her cheek. She swung the cleaver with devastating precision, biting through the heavy cartilage of the steer's ribcage. Thwack! Crunch! Harlan stood in the darkness, watching her. To the people inside that barn, this was a grotesque sight. A woman hacking apart a carcass in the dark, while music played a stone's throw away. To Harlan, it was the most beautiful thing he had seen since he came down the mountain. It was competence. It was survival. She wasn't relying on anyone to do the ugly work for her. He stepped into the ring of lantern light. Abigail heard his boot crunch on the gravel. She didn't jump. She just stopped her swing, mid-air turned her head, and lowered the cleaver. She saw him standing there in his tight wool suit. "Lost?" she asked, her breathing heavy from the exertion. "No," Harlan said. He walked closer. The smell of raw meat and copper was heavy in the air. He looked at the steer, then at her. "Cleaver's dull," he said. Abigail scoffed, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Town grindstone is cracked. Have to make do." Harlan reached to his belt. He unclasped a long, bone-handled hunting knife from its leather sheath. He held it out to her handle first. Abigail looked at the knife, then at him. Slowly she reached out and took it. Her rough fingers brushed his. He felt the calluses. He felt the strength in her grip. She turned back to the steer. She slid the blade into the joint. It parted the meat and sinew like water. She let out a low whistle. "Good steel. Forged it myself," Harlan said. He leaned against the rough wood of the shed, crossing his arms. "You weren't at the dance?" "Nobody wants the butcher's girl at a dance, Mr. Wade. They want the cuts I prepare, but they don't want the smell of the blood in their parlor." She kept working, pulling the hide back. "Besides, Josephine is the one you came to town for." "Who told you that?" "The whole town, and my eyes." She didn't look at him. "You're rich. She's pretty. It's math." "I'm bad at math," Harlan said. Abigail paused. She turned to face him, the bloody knife hanging loose in her hand. The lantern light caught the jagged silver of her burned scar. She didn't try to hide it in the shadows. She stared him down. "What do you want, Mr. Wade?" Harlan met her gaze. He didn't use flowery words. He didn't know how, and he knew she'd see right through them if he tried. "I live at 9,000 feet. Harlan said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "Winter lasts 7 months. The wind blows hard enough to strip bark off a pine. The work never stops. If you get sick, you cure yourself or you die. There's no theater. There's no society." Abigail frowned, her grip tightening on the knife handle. "Why are you telling me this? Because your sister would be dead by November." Harlan stepped closer, entering her space. He didn't flinch at the blood on her apron. "She's a porcelain doll. I don't need a doll. I need a partner. I need someone who doesn't panic when the fire goes out. Someone who knows how to work a knife." Abigail's breath hitched. For a second, the tough, cynical armor cracked, revealing a profound shock beneath. "You're out of your mind." "My wagon is fixed tomorrow morning," Harlan said, ignoring her. "I'm buying 2 more mules. I leave at noon." He reached out. He didn't touch her face or her hair. He reached out and gently took her scarred, blistered, bloody left hand in his massive, scarred right hand. He ran his thumb over the rough knuckles. "Pack your things, Abigail." He let go of her hand, turned, and walked back into the dark, leaving her standing under the lantern, staring at the empty space where he had been. Dust motes danced in the pale grey light bleeding through the cracks in the attic boards. Abigail sat on the edge of her cot. She held a worn canvas sack. Inside lay everything she owned: 2 flannel shirts, 3 pairs of woolen socks she'd darned until they were more patch than original thread, a heavy pair of work trousers and a tin comb. She didn't own a mirror. She hadn't looked in one willingly since the rendering vat blew. Downstairs, the house was a hornet's nest. She could hear her father's heavy, pacing footsteps vibrating through the floor joists. She heard Josephine's shrill, weeping voice piercing the floorboards like rusted nails. "He's a savage, Papa! A dirty, filthy savage!" Josephine wailed. "He humiliated me in front of the whole town." "You cannot let her go with him. It makes us look like we're selling our stock to a butcher." "Keep your voice down," her father hissed. "And what am I supposed to do, forbid a grown woman from leaving? He paid his bill. He loaded his mules. If she wants to throw her life away on some frozen rock, I wash my hands of it." Abigail stood up. The floorboards didn't squeak. She knew exactly where to step to keep them silent. Years of trying to be invisible in a house that only valued her for her muscle had taught her how to move like a ghost. She tied the canvas sack with a length of rough twine. She felt no heartbreak leaving this room. It was just a box where she slept between shifts of back-breaking labor. When she walked down the stairs, the argument in the parlor stopped dead. Josephine stood by the fireplace, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Mr. Farnsworth stood near the door, his face a tight mask of embarrassment and anger. Abigail didn't stop. She walked straight past them toward the front door. "You're a fool, Abby," Josephine spat, dropping the handkerchief. The sweet airy voice was gone, replaced by a venomous hiss. "He doesn't want a wife. He wants a pack mule he doesn't have to pay. You'll be dead by Christmas and nobody will come looking." Abigail paused with her hand on the brass doorknob. The brass felt cold. She turned her head, fixing her storm-grey eyes on her beautiful, useless sister. "If I stay here, I'm a pack mule," Abigail said flatly. "At least up there the air is clean." She opened the door and stepped out into the muddy street. Harlan was waiting by the hitching post outside the mercantile. He had 2 new mules, their coats slick and thick, loaded down with crates of flour salt ammunition and tools. He stood beside the lead mule, adjusting a leather cinch. He wore a heavy canvas duster that hung down to his calves, stained with pine pitch and old grease. He didn't look up when he heard her boots on the boardwalk. He just kept working the thick leather strap through the iron buckle. "You're late," he said. His voice was gravel. "Had to listen to a sermon," Abigail replied. She stopped at the edge of the boardwalk and dropped her canvas sack into the mud at his feet. Harlan finally looked at her. He took in her attire. She wore heavy men's work boots, trousers thick enough to turn a briar, and a wool coat that looked like it had survived a war. No bonnet, no ribbons, just a hat pulled low over her scarred face. He bent down, picked up her sack, and tossed it effortlessly over the back of the second mule. He tied it down with a quick, brutal knot. "Walk or ride?" he asked. "Walk," she said. "Mules have enough weight," Harlan grunted. It wasn't a sound of approval, but it wasn't a dismissal either. He took the lead rope of the first mule and started walking. He didn't wait for her. He didn't offer his arm. He just started the long trek out of Cutter's Ridge. Abigail fell into step behind him. As they passed the livery, the saloon, and the scattered houses, she felt the weight of eyes on her back. Faces pressed against dirty glass windows. Women whispering behind their hands on porches. They were watching the town monster leave with the mountain savage. She kept her chin level. She smelled the sulphur and manure of the town for the last time. Ahead of her, Harlan smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. It was a harsh smell, but it was honest. They crossed the wooden bridge at the edge of town. The sound of the rushing water below drowned out the noise of the settlement. When her boots hit the dirt trail on the other side, Abigail didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth remembering. The incline started almost immediately. The trail was a narrow ribbon of packed dirt, winding through dense, suffocating stands of lodgepole pine. For the first 2 hours, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of hooves, the squeak of leather harnesses, and their own heavy breathing. Abigail's legs burned. The muscles in her calves tightened like coiled springs, screaming against the relentless upward grade. The air was getting thinner, tasting sharp and metallic in her lungs. She didn't slow down. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad, solid expanse of Harlan's back. If he could walk it, she could walk it. By late afternoon, the temperature plummeted. The trees grew sparse, replaced by jagged outcroppings of grey granite. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and threatening. Harlan stopped. He tied the lead mule to a stunted, wind-twisted cedar and walked back to the second animal. He unbuckled a heavy canvas tarp and pulled out a thick, woven woolen blanket. He turned and tossed it at Abigail. She caught it against her chest. The wool was scratchy and smelled intensely of animal fat and smoke. "Wrap up," Harlan said. "Wind's coming down off the glacier. Cuts right through cotton." "I'm fine," she said, though her teeth were locked tight to keep from chattering. "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his pale blue eyes narrowing. "Pride gets you killed up here. You freeze to death, I have to dig a hole in frozen dirt." "I hate digging." Abigail stared at him. It was the most he had spoken all day. There was no warmth in his words, only cold, brutal pragmatism. She respected that. She unfolded the blanket and draped it over her shoulders, pulling it tight across her chest. The wind howled down the canyon, a low moaning sound that vibrated in her teeth. It carried a biting frost that immediately numbed her nose and cheeks. They kept moving. The trail grew steeper, treacherous with loose scree and hidden ice patches. An hour before, dusk disaster struck. The lead mule hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. Its front hooves shot out. The beast let out a terrified bray, scrambling frantically for purchase. The dead weight of the loaded packs pulled it sideways towards the sheer drop of the ravine. "Hold!" Harlan roared. He threw his weight backward, digging the heels of his boots into the frozen dirt, wrapping the lead rope tight around his forearm. The rope went taut, with a sound like a rifle crack. The mule slid closer to the edge, its hind legs bicycling over the void. Harlan's boots started to slide. He was strong, but he was losing the battle against gravity and 1,000 pounds of panic. Abigail didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She dropped her blanket. She sprinted up the icy trail, ignoring the treacherous footing. She didn't go for the rope. She went for the mule. She threw herself at the beast's hindquarters, just as it began to slip completely over the edge. She grabbed the thick leather breeching strap with both hands, planted her boots against a jagged spur of rock, and pulled with everything she had. Her shoulders screamed. The old burn scar on her neck tightened agonizingly as her muscles strained. She felt the skin on her palms tearing against the stiff leather. "Pull!" She grunted, her voice a guttural rasp. Harlan heaved on the rope. Together they arrested the mule's slide. For a terrifying, agonizing 10 seconds, nobody moved. The animal thrashed, kicking loose rocks down into the darkening ravine. "Easy!" Harlan hissed to the animal. "Easy, you dumb son of a bitch!" Slowly, inch by inch, they dragged the mule back onto the solid shelf of the trail. The animal scrambled upright, blowing hard, its sides heaving. Harlan tied off the rope to a heavy boulder. He stood up, chest heaving, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He looked at Abigail. She was leaning against the rock wall, rubbing her raw, bleeding palms on her trousers. She picked up a handful of dirty snow and pressed it against the fresh scrapes. She didn't ask if he was all right. She didn't wait for praise. Harlan walked over to her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, greasy tin. He popped the lid off. The smell of rancid bear fat and bitter willow bark hit her nose. He held it out to her. "Told you I had salve." Abigail looked at the tin, then up at his face. His expression was completely unreadable. A mask of weathered skin and hard angles. But the gesture was there. She reached out and took the tin. She scooped out a dollop of the vile-smelling grease and slathered it over her raw palms. It stung like fire, then immediately went numb. "Thanks," she muttered. "We camp here," Harlan said, turning his back to her. Too dark to cross the ridge. They built a fire in silence. Harlan gathered the deadfall. Abigail cleared the snow and arranged the rocks. They worked around each other in a strange, unchoreographed dance. They were two solitary creatures forced into a sudden, harsh proximity. Dinner was a piece of salted pork roasted on a stick and a tin cup of coffee, so strong and black it looked like crude oil. They sat on opposite sides of the fire. The heat baked Abigail's face, while her back froze against the night air. "Why did you really come, Abigail?" Harlan asked suddenly. His voice startled her. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange coming from his mouth. "Rough." She stared into the flames, watching a piece of pine sap boil and burst. "You saw my sister. You saw my father. What was I supposed to do? Wait until I blew myself up in another vat for them? You're not afraid of this?" He gestured vaguely at the dark, looming shapes of the mountains around them, the vast, empty wilderness. "I'm afraid of dying useless." Abigail said softly, her voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. "I'm not afraid of the cold." Harlan didn't answer. He just poured the dregs of his coffee into the dirt and pulled his hat down over his eyes. "Sleep," he ordered. "We hit the summit by noon tomorrow." The cabin sat in a bowl-shaped depression near the timberline, sheltered from the worst of the northern gales by a massive spine of grey rock. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress built against the elements. The logs were thick as whiskey barrels, stripped of bark and chinked with a mixture of mud horsehair and moss. The roof was heavy sod, currently buried under a foot of late spring snow. There was no porch, no decorative trim. The single window was a square of thick, cloudy glass, the size of a dinner plate. When they arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snowpack. Harlan unlocked the heavy oak door with an iron key the size of a railroad spike. He pushed it open. The hinges screamed in protest. Abigail stepped inside. The air in the cabin was stagnant, freezing, and smelled heavily of old wood smoke, cured leather, and something distinctly feral. It was dark. The only light came from the open doorway. "Stay there," Harlan muttered, pushing past her. He walked to the massive stone hearth, taking up the entire back wall. He struck a match against the stone. The sharp smell of sulphur cut through the stale air. He lit a twist of dry grass and shoved it under a pile of kindling. As the fire caught, throwing flickering orange light across the room, Abigail took in her new reality. It was a single room. The floor was rough-hewn planks, scarred by heavy boots. On the left wall was a massive bed frame built directly into the logs, piled high with thick, untanned furs, beaver wolf and bear. On the right was a heavy wooden table and 2 chairs made of twisted branches. From the rafters hung traps, chains, drying herbs, and strips of dark, tough jerky. There were no curtains, no rugs, no soft edges. It was the most masculine space she had ever seen. It felt like walking into the den of a hibernating predator. Harlan stood up from the hearth, dusting off his knees. He looked around the room, seeing it through her eyes for the first time. For a brief second, Abigail saw a flicker of something close to uncertainty in his hard gaze. He was used to this. He didn't know if she could stomach it. "It's not much," he said, his voice defensive, sharp. "Keeps the wind out." Abigail walked to the table. She ran her hand over the rough, unsanded surface of the wood. She looked at the heavy iron skillet hanging by the fire, crusted with old grease. She looked at the massive pile of furs on the single bed. "It's dirty," she said. Harlan stiffened, his jaw locked. "I live alone." "Not anymore," Abigail replied. She didn't sound angry. She sounded determined. She dropped her canvas sack on one of the chairs. She unbuttoned her heavy coat and threw it over the back. She rolled up the sleeves of her flannel shirt, exposing her thick forearms and the fresh red welts on her palms. She looked at him. Where is the water bucket, and where is the lie? Harlan stared at her. He had expected tears. He had expected a shrieking fit, a demand to be taken back down the mountain. He had braced himself for it. Instead, she was asking for soap. He pointed to a heavy wooden bucket near the door. "Spring is 50 yards out back. Chop through the ice. Soap's in the tin on the shelf." Abigail grabbed the bucket. It was heavy, reinforced with iron bands. She didn't struggle with it. She walked out the back door into the biting cold. Harlan stood alone in his cabin. He listened to the crunch of her boots in the snow, receding toward the spring. He looked at the empty chair where she had sat her bag. He walked over to the bed. He grabbed a massive, heavy wolf pelt and dragged it to the floor near the hearth. He grabbed a spare woolen blanket and tossed it on top. It wasn't much of a second bed, but it was a boundary. When Abigail returned the bucket full of icy, clear water, she saw the makeshift pallet by the fire. She looked at it, then at the main bed, then at Harlan. He was at the table methodically cleaning his rifle. He didn't look up. "I sleep by the fire," Harlan said gruffly, running an oiled rag down the steel barrel. "You take the furs." Abigail set the heavy bucket down on the hearth with a thud. "I don't need charity, Mr. Wade. It's your house." "It's cold," he snapped, finally looking at her. "The furs are warm. Don't argue with me about survival." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was a stubbornness in her that matched his own, a thick, hard shell, built by years of being treated like a beast of burden. She wasn't used to people giving up the comfortable spot for her. It made her suspicious. "Fine," she said shortly. She turned away, grabbed a stiff bristle brush from the shelf, and dunked it into the freezing water. She began to scrub the heavy iron skillet. She scrubbed with a ferocity that made her shoulders burn the harsh scrape of the bristles, filling the quiet cabin. Harlan went back to cleaning his rifle. They didn't speak for the rest of the evening. They ate beans and hardtack, the silence between them heavy thick with unspoken rules and guarded boundaries. The wind picked up outside, howling around the corners of the log walls, rattling the single window pane. Inside the fire crackled. The smell of lye soap began to overpower the smell of stale smoke. As Abigail finally lay down on the bed, sinking into the surprisingly soft, dense heat of the animal furs, she listened to Harlan breathing heavily on the floor by the hearth. He was a stranger. He was harsh, unyielding, and totally devoid of grace. But as the wind screamed outside, unable to penetrate the thick logs of the cabin, Abigail closed her eyes and realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. Winter did not announce itself with a flurry of romantic snow. It hit the ridge like a swung anvil. By the second week of November, the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the temperature dropped so fast the pine trees snapped in the night like distant rifle fire. Inside the cabin, the silence shifted from a hostile barrier to a heavy, shared blanket. Abigail learned the geometry of Harlan's life. It was a life dictated entirely by calories, heat, and daylight. They woke before dawn in the freezing dark. Harlan would build the fire from the banked coals, while Abigail broke the ice in the water bucket with the heavy handle of her skinning knife. Breakfast was oats, boiled in snowmelt, flavored with a lump of hardened salt pork. They ate in the dark, the only sound the scraping of tin spoons against tin bowls. She proved her worth not with words, but with blood and grease. Harlan brought the carcasses to the porch. Beaver fox, the occasional lean winter buck. He expected her to balk at the mountain work. Town butchers dealt with drained meat. Trappers dealt with guts, frozen hide, and the sour stench of wild musk. Abigail didn't blink. The first time he dropped a frozen stiff buck on the snow-packed porch, he handed her a sharp knife and stepped back, waiting for the hesitation. She knelt in the snow, her breath pluming in thick white clouds, and found the joint. Her hands, already rough from town labor, cracked and bled in the biting wind. The blood froze on her knuckles. She ignored it. She worked with the mechanical, brutal efficiency of a woman who had spent 10 years standing over rendering vats. She stripped the hide, severed the tendons, and quartered the meat, while Harlan watched, leaning against the doorframe, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He didn't offer praise. Praise was a town currency. But when she finally stood up, her back aching and her apron stiff with frozen gore, she found a cup of boiling black coffee waiting on the chopping block. "Knife's getting dull," was all Harlan said. That night she sat by the fire, dragging a whetstone across the steel blade in long rhythmic strokes. Harlan sat at the table greasing his traps. The smell of rancid bear fat and hot iron filled the small room. "You missed a patch of fat on the flank," Harlan muttered, not looking up from the steel jaws of his wolf trap. "Fat rots the hide. Dock $1 off the pelt price." Abigail didn't stop her grinding rhythm. "Shk, shk." "My hands were numb. You want it perfect, you skin it yourself." Harlan finally looked at her. His eyes caught the firelight, burning a pale, strange blue. He set the trap down. He walked over to where she sat on the floor, crouched beside her, and grabbed her left hand. She flinched, gripping the knife tighter in her right, but he didn't grab her to hurt her. He pulled off her stiff leather glove. Her knuckles were split wide open, the skin red, inflamed, and raw from frost nip. He didn't say a word. He went to his shelf, pulled down the vile-smelling willow bark and fat salve, and kneeled back down. He scooped a thick glob of it onto his fingers and began to work it into the cracked skin of her hands. His calluses scraped against hers. It hurt like hell. Abigail clenched her jaw, refusing to pull away. "You lose a finger to frostbite your dead weight," Harlan said, his voice a low gravel rumble. "I won't lose a finger." She shot back, her voice tight. "See that you don't." He rubbed the grease over the jagged silver burn scar on her wrist. His thumb lingered there for a fraction of a second, tracing the raised ridge of dead tissue. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Abigail. You're not back in that shop." He dropped her hand, wiped the excess grease on his trousers, and went back to his traps. Abigail sat in the silence, staring at her shining, numb hands. Her heart hammered a strange, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She had been braced for a fight, braced for the familiar sting of being told she was careless or ugly or wrong. Instead, she received harsh, unvarnished care. She realized then that Harlan didn't know how to be gentle, but he knew how to keep things alive. January brought the whiteouts. For weeks, the wind screamed around the eaves, piling snowdrifts halfway up the tiny window. They lived in a twilight state, the world reduced to the 4 log walls and the roaring stone hearth. The proximity should have bred madness. In Cutter's Ridge, people trapped indoors turned vicious, picking at each other's floors until the parlor felt like a prison. Here, the sheer scale of the danger outside rendered small arguments meaningless. If they argued, it was over the depth of the snow or the dwindling supply of flour. Then came the morning the fire almost died. Harlan had gone out to check the Deep Valley trapline. It was a foolish risk, but the food stores were getting critically low, and he'd seen fresh elk tracks near the tree line. He told Abigail he'd be back by noon. By 3 o'clock, the sky turned a sickening, bruised purple. The wind shifted howling straight down from the glacier. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. Abigail paced the length of the cabin. She threw another heavy pine log onto the fire, watching the pitch bubble and hiss. She walked to the window, scraping her fingernails against the thick frost on the glass, trying to see through the white oblivion outside. Nothing. Just a wall of swirling, screaming snow. By 5 o'clock, the panic set in. It wasn't the frantic, weeping panic of a town girl. It was a cold, heavy stone in her gut. She knew the math. A man out in a squall this heavy, moving through waist-deep drifts, had maybe 3 hours before his blood began to freeze. She pulled on her heavy boots. She grabbed her coat, wrapping a wool scarf tightly around her face, leaving only a slit for her eyes. She took the heavy coil of hemp rope from the corner, tied one end around her waist, and secured the other to the heavy iron handle of the front door. She stepped out onto the porch. The wind hit her like a physical blow, knocking her back a step. The cold was instantly agonizing, a million tiny needles driving into her exposed skin. She couldn't see past the edge of the porch roof. "Harlan!" she screamed. The wind ripped the sound from her throat, carrying it away into the void. She stepped off the porch, wading into the snow. It was up to her thighs. She fought her way forward, following the faint depression in the snow where the trail used to be. She went 10 feet. 20. The rope went taut. She had reached the end of her tether. Harlan. She strained against the rope, her lungs burning the icy air, searing her throat like swallowed glass. She was about to turn back defeated when she saw a shape. It wasn't walking. It was crawling, a massive snow-covered mound, dragging itself blindly through the drifts. Abigail lunged forward, fighting the tension of the rope. She fell to her knees in the deep powder, reaching out blindly. Her gloved hand slammed into solid muscle covered in frozen canvas. Harlan collapsed, his face buried in the snow. Abigail didn't try to lift him. He was 200 pounds of dead weight. She grabbed him by the thick collar of his duster, planted her boots in the snow, and pulled backward, using the tension of the rope on her waist to drag him. She hauled him inch by agonizing inch, her shoulders screaming, the old scar on her neck burning like a hot wire. She dragged him onto the porch, kicked the door open, and hauled him over the threshold. She slammed the heavy oak door shut against the howling storm, throwing the iron latch. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening. Harlan lay motionless on the floorboards, a mountain of snow and ice. His lips were a terrifying shade of blue, his skin pale as wax. His breathing was shallow, a wet rattling sound deep in his chest. "Get up," Abigail ordered, her voice shaking. She dropped to her knees, tearing at his frozen canvas coat. "Harlan, get up." His eyelids fluttered. "Fell." He slurred, his jaw locked tight with shivers. "Creek," broke the ice. "Wet." Abigail's stomach plummeted. Wet in a blizzard was a death sentence. The hypothermia was already shutting his organs down. She worked with frantic speed. She dragged him closer to the roaring hearth. Her hands, numb and shaking, struggled with his frozen buckles and buttons. She pulled a knife from her belt and simply cut the heavy leather laces of his boots, yanking them off his feet. She stripped him down to his skin, throwing the sodden, freezing clothes into a pile. He was covered in old scars, claw marks on his ribs, a jagged knife wound on his shoulder. But right now his powerful body was violently convulsing. She grabbed the heavy wolf and bear furs from the bed and dragged them to the floor, piling them over him. It wasn't enough. He couldn't generate his own heat anymore. His body was a dying engine. Abigail didn't hesitate. She threw off her own heavy coat, her boots, and her damp outer trousers. She crawled under the heavy pile of furs, pressing her warm body directly against his freezing skin. He felt like a block of ice. The shock of the cold against her bare arms made her gasp, but she wrapped her arms around his chest, burying her face in the crook of his icy neck. "Breathe," she commanded, pressing herself tighter against him. "You don't get to die on me. You brought me up here. You don't get to leave me." For hours the cabin was silent, except for the crackle of the fire and the violent rattling shivers of Harlan's body. Abigail lay there in the dark, smelling the wet wool, the wood smoke, and the metallic scent of his skin. She poured her own heat into him, fiercely, stubbornly refusing to let the cold take him. Sometime near dawn, the shivering stopped. Harlan's breathing deepened. The terrifying blue hue left his lips, replaced by a deep, flushed red. His skin, previously ice-cold, began to radiate a terrifying heat. The hypothermia was gone. The fever had arrived. For the next 3 days, Abigail fought a different kind of war. Harlan's lungs had filled with fluid from the freezing water. He thrashed in delirium, throwing off the heavy furs, coughing up dark, bloody phlegm. Abigail didn't sleep. She kept the fire roaring so hot the pitch in the logs bubbled and popped. She boiled snowmelt-dissolving handfuls of bitter willow bark into the water. When Harlan clamped his jaw shut in his fever dreams, she pried his teeth apart with a wooden spoon and forced the foul-tasting liquid down his throat, ignoring his weak struggles. In his delirium, the tough, cynical shell burned away. He muttered at the ceiling. "Too quiet," he whispered, staring with glassy, unseeing eyes at the rafters. "Ash doesn't talk back. Just cold. Always cold." Abigail soaked a rag in cold water and pressed it to his burning forehead. "I'm here," she said, her voice a raw, exhausted croak. "It's not quiet. I'm right here." He grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, trembling but desperate. He looked at her truly, looked at her through the haze of the fever. He didn't see the scar. He didn't see the rough town butcher. "Abigail," he breathed the word a broken rasp. "Drink," she commanded, softly holding the tin cup to his lips. On the fourth morning, the wind finally died. Sunlight, blinding and pure, streamed through the frosted window pane, cutting a sharp yellow square across the floorboards. Abigail was sitting on the floor, her back against the heavy log frame of the bed, a whetstone idle in her lap. Her eyes were bloodshot, dark purple bruises blooming under her eyes. She looked like a ghost. She heard a rustle of heavy furs. Harlan pushed himself up on one elbow. His chest heaved with the effort, his muscles weak and trembling. He looked around the sweltering cabin. He looked at the pile of his cut, ruined clothes. Then he looked at Abigail. His blue eyes were clear. The fever was broken. He took a slow, rattling breath, wincing as the pain in his bruised ribs caught up to him. He stared at her, taking in her exhausted posture, the dirty water basin, the empty tin cup. "You look like hell," Harlan rasped. His throat sounded like it was filled with broken glass. Abigail let her head fall back against the wood, a dry, humorless laugh escaping her chapped lips. "You cut a dashing figure yourself, Mr. Wade." Harlan slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, leaning heavily against the wall. He reached out his large, scarred hand, crossing the distance between them. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He gently brushed his knuckles against the rough, bruised skin under her eye. "You didn't let the fire die," he said quietly. "I told you," Abigail whispered, closing her eyes at the touch. "I'm not afraid of the cold." Spring arrived, not with a warm breeze, but with the sound of breaking. The ice on the creek shattered. The snowpack turned to deep, treacherous mud. The eaves of the cabin dripped relentlessly, a rhythmic drumming that replaced the howling wind. Harlan's recovery was slow, a fact that infuriated him. For a month, he was confined to the cabin and the porch, carving new traps from cedar while his lungs healed. Abigail took over the deep lines. She walked his trails, checked his sets, and brought back the late-season pelts. She learned to read the woods, substituting the smell of town coal for the scent of wet pine and damp earth. They settled into a new rhythm. The silence between them was no longer cautious. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two gears perfectly aligned, pulling the heavy weight of survival together. There were no sweeping declarations of romance. Love up here wasn't a poem. It was Abigail finding her heavy boots, greased and drying by the fire before she woke up. It was Harlan eating a plate of slightly burned venison without a single complaint, knowing she had spent 3 hours tracking the beast in the mud. In late May, the mud dried enough for the trail to become passable. Abigail was in the yard, her sleeves rolled up, scraping the last bits of fat from a heavy bear hide draped over a wooden stretching frame. The sun felt hot on her shoulders. Harlan sat on the porch steps, methodically cleaning his rifle. The sharp crack of a breaking branch echoed up the trail. Harlan stopped wiping the barrel. He slid a brass cartridge into the chamber with a lethal metallic clack. He didn't stand, but his entire body tensed, his eyes locked on the tree line. A horse crested the ridge. It was lathered, its chest heaving, sinking up to its fetlocks in the spring mud. The rider was a young man wearing a wool suit that was far too clean for the high country, though it was currently splattered with mud. He looked terrified. He pulled the horse to a stop at the edge of the clearing, staring at the small, brutal cabin, the massive bear hide, and the two people watching him with flat, unwelcoming eyes. Abigail recognized him. Tate, the telegraph operator's boy from Cutter's Ridge. Tate swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the rifle resting casually across Harlan's knees. "Miss Abigail!" He called out, his voice cracking. Abigail didn't drop her scraping knife. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of grease and dirt. "What do you want, Tate?" The boy fumbled in his breast pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Your father sent me. Paid me $10 to make the ride." He looked around the austere, wild clearing, visibly shuddering. "He wanted me to see if you were dead. The town figured... Well, after the winter we had, they figured you froze." "I'm breathing," Abigail said flatly. "You can keep your $10. Ride back down." "Wait," Tate stammered, holding up the paper. He sent a message. "Josephine. She married a man from Denver, a railway investor. They bought a big stone house on Capitol Hill." Abigail's expression didn't change. She felt absolutely nothing. No jealousy, no regret. It sounded like a story about strangers in a foreign land. Good for her. The message, Tate pushed on gaining a little courage, is that they need a head housekeeper. Your father says if you leave this savage, if you come down now, they'll pay your train fare. You can sleep in a real bed. You won't have to butcher meat anymore. He says it's your last chance to come back to civilization before you turn into an animal. The clearing went dead silent. The only sound was the wind rustling through the newly green pine needles. Abigail looked at the piece of paper fluttering in Tate's trembling hand. She thought of the parlor in Cutter's Ridge, the suffocating heat, the smell of cheap perfume, the way they looked at her hands, her scar as if she were a broken tool they had to hide in the kitchen. She looked down at her hands now. They were calloused, scarred, stained with bark dye and blood. They were strong enough to drag a dying man through a blizzard. They were hands that kept the fire burning. She turned and looked at Harlan. He was watching her. His face was an unreadable mask, his jaw tight. He didn't say a word. He wouldn't beg her to stay. He was a mountain man. He believed that if a creature wanted to run, you let it run. But beneath the stoic exterior in the tight grip he held on the rifle stock, Abigail saw the raw, terrifying vulnerability of a man who had finally found warmth and was bracing for the cold to return. Abigail turned back to the boy on the horse. She walked over to the chopping block, picked up the heavy iron-headed splitting axe, and slammed it down into the wood with a deafening crack. Tate's horse shied, backing up a step. "You ride back down that mountain, Tate," Abigail said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the clearing like a physical force. "You tell my father to burn his letter. Tell him Josephine can scrub her own damn floors." Tate blinked, confused. "But it's a house in Denver. You'd be safe." Abigail looked at the muddy yard, the heavy log walls, and the man sitting on the porch. "I'm already safe, and I'm exactly where I belong." Tate hesitated, looking from the heavy axe in the wood to Harlan's rifle. He nodded once, jerked the reins, and kicked his horse into a muddy retreat back down the trail. Abigail watched him go until the sound of hooves faded completely into the murmur of the creek. She walked over to the porch, her boots leaving heavy muddy tracks on the wooden planks. She stood over Harlan. He looked up at her, the tension slowly bleeding out of his shoulders. He reached out his rough, calloused hand, wrapping around her scarred wrist. He pulled her down to sit beside him on the steps. They didn't embrace. They didn't kiss. They sat shoulder to shoulder, Two battered, hardened survivors looking out over a jagged, beautiful wilderness that belonged only to them. The air smelled of wet earth, crushed pine, and a hard-won spring. "We need to patch the roof," Harlan muttered, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "Sod's washing out on the north side." Abigail leaned her weight against his shoulder. "I'll mix the mud. You haul the dirt." "Deal," the mountain man said. If you loved this raw, gritty conclusion to Harlan and Abigail's Wild West romance, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with friends who crave dramas built on survival and deep, authentic partnership, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next incredible tale. Drop a comment below. Did Abigail make the right choice, staying on the mountain, or would you have taken the train to Denver? See you in the next video.